We're now going to talk about the attack on Senator Charles Sumner. We looked at this image yesterday and analyzed it. This is a fairly famous image from this time period, and we need to talk about the background that will make this make sense. So it reads around the same time that violence was happening in Kansas. So what we mean by that, bushwhackers and jayhawkers are attacking Kansas and Missouri respectively. Bushwhackers go into Lawrence, burn down some homes, burn down an anti-slavery newspaper building, kill a few people. John Brown, in revenge, attacks Pottawatomie Creek and kills 5 pro-slavery people. So that's around the same time period. We're going to see in Congress things were getting pretty violent also. So there was a Senator Charles Sumner, very, very anti-slavery. He was from Massachusetts. He gets up in front of the Senate one day and he gives a speech and basically blasts the South and said they are 100% responsible for all the violence that's happening in Kansas. And I certainly do think that the South had played a role in this. Bushwhackers were from Missouri, so they were Southerners. They burnt down Lawrence. They were attacking other settlements. But then you had people like John Brown, what he was doing. He wasn't a Southerner. The Jayhawkers attacking into Missouri, they weren't Southerners. But anyway, he just rails on the South and says they are 100% responsible for all this. Anyway, Southern representatives, they weren't pleased. So there was a man named Preston Brooks from South Carolina. He was offended by this speech. And originally he intended to challenge Sumner to a duel. Dueling was still a thing back then. But he eventually decides, you know what? Sumner's not even worth my time. I'm just going to attack him. So what he does is 2 days later, it says Presto, it should say Preston. 2 days later, he shows up to the Senate. Charles Sumner sitting there at his desk doing some work, and he takes out a cane. He proceeds to beat him to the point where he was unconscious. It was an absolutely brutal attack. Comes up from behind, hits him in the head. Sumner goes down. Sumner tries to get up, but he's kind of trapped underneath his desk, continues to beat him with the cane. Eventually, the cane snapped, but didn't stop Preston Brooks. Sumner tries to get up. At this point, he's almost blinded because there was so much blood. So he's trying to stumble away. Preston Brooks hits him again, and he starts to collapse because he's unconscious because he's been hit so many times. Brooks grabs him by the lapel. The lapel is like the top of your suit jacket, and with one hand he's holding him up, and the other hand he's still has his cane. He's beating him. There were a couple other representatives that were watching this. If we go back, no, I can't go back on that. They stepped in to try to help him, and there was another guy with Preston Brooks, another Southerner, pulls out a gun and points it at the representatives that wanted to try to help Charles Sumner, and said, "Let him be." Wouldn't let him help. Um, Sumner did survive, but his injuries were pretty bad. It took him over 3 years to recover and return to the job. Meanwhile, Preston Brooks, he was arrested. He was charged with assault. It went to trial. He was found guilty of assault, but he was only fined. He was fined something like, in today's dollars, $8,000 to $10,000. So not a ton of money. Never did any time in jail. He ended up resigning from his position in the Senate, but he ran for re-election shortly thereafter and won again. So it just goes to show um, the the violence that was happening. Ignore that. The violence that was happening. It was happening in the Senate also.